I should mention this is just an idea. It's just a sketch. I don't even have a proper model for this, which is unusual for me. But here are some things that you might have done. I'm not going to read through it. You can have a quick look. And a hand up if you've ever needed something like one of these things. I'll give you a moment. Yeah, pretty much everyone. Okay, yeah, figured that. That includes me. Basically, what we want is to set and get variable values, and it would be nice if we didn't have to reach for execute all the time, wouldn't it? So let's first do a little recap of the things that you might have been doing to solve this problem. The basic idea is that we have excellent syntax for assigning a variable, but if I have the variable name from somewhere else, then things get a bit iffy. So the classic solution is you concatenate the variable name with the name of a variable that holds the value you want to set, and then you throw that to execute. Of course, if the variable name is whatever variable that holds the value, that's not going to work. But then we can use a dfn for that, and we have this magic name omega, and that doesn't work when you have a whole bunch of variables that you want to set, including 0 variables that will go very wrong. So we can abstract that out until you realize that you're organizing your code and you actually want to set the value in a different namespace. So then you figure out, oh, execute can take a left argument, or we can use a dot, and it's all nice, except maybe where the namespace that you want to assign to is also actually a parameter that you want to give, and now it's just a global inside the function, so that's no good. But then we can use maybe an operator, because we don't have any more arguments to throw at it, but then you can't use each on that, so then maybe we want to move things around a little bit, but then actually you want names and values together as pairs, and then finally you figure out how the way to do it, only to discover that this is darn slow. How slow? Well, I don't really know what to compare this to, because how fast could it be if we had something like this? But to get an idea, there's actually something similar. When we're dealing with these objects, could be GUI objects on Windows, but also in general these built-in objects, timer objects, and so on, the session object, those we can set properties for them. And setting a property is very similar to setting a variable. For that we use ws, and it can also take these name value pairs and the target. So it's very similar in that respect. So let's just try something generic. Every such object has a generic data property that doesn't do anything, it just keeps data, so that's the closest we can get to a plain variable. And we're just going to set it to a very simple value. So here we're doing a runtime comparison between this expression we figured out and ws and see how they stack up. The results are different here because ws returns the previous value. That doesn't work for setting a variable, of course. We can see that potentially we could gain some benefit. And this is even dealing with objects where they could have all kinds of effects when you set the properties. We just want to set a variable. So this is what we've got, and yeah. What about getting the value of a variable? If you have the name in a variable and you want to get that, so of course you just apply execute. That doesn't work again if you've got multiple variables. But each to the rescue, except in a different namespace. Then, a lot of times, you actually know what value you would want if it hadn't been set. Ever tried this? Default left argument, some global default value for some parameter that you want to set. But luckily, we can build that in. But of course, again, the target here is a problem, so we can't really use multiple namespaces that represent objects that we are dealing with, or states, so we have to abstract that out as well. And again, name value pairs might be a good idea. And we're right back at this being horribly slow. How slow? Similarly to what we did for setting things, we can use wg to get property values. Again, it's not exactly the same, and it doesn't provide the functionality of a fallback value. So let's get rid of that, just to compare the basic fetch the value to what quad_wg does. And again, quad_wg has to deal with all these GUI things. So, but at least in the ballpark, we should get an idea. So let's just fetch 100 times this generic data property and compare that and something similar to that. So this looks pretty promising. Actually, there's something you can do. Here's a little secret thing that will make all the Dyalog people shudder. And that is quad_or. Right. But what you might not know is that if you give the name of a variable, not a function, to quad_or, it just returns the value. Okay. And just we're dealing with variables, so this should be fine. Of course, we need an each that might have some overhead. But let's see if we use quad_or, which basically just does this. It goes and looks for a name, fetches its value. Does it look reasonable what we figured out with quad_wg? So we add that to our comparison. Notice there's an overhead of an each here, which quad_wg doesn't have. Yep, it looks reasonable. Okay, so we've got this. There's actually another thing here. We'll get to in a moment. Let's put in our quad_or, and then one day we hit a variable that contains a reference, a namespace. And if you go give the name of a namespace to quad_or, it does return this strange object representation and not the value. So we have to check the name class first to make sure that it is a proper variable that's not a namespace, only to then eventually hit a fallback value, and that error guard is very slow. Much better if we check the name class first to see that it exists before we fetch its value. So let's compare these for when we actually need the fallback value. They're too long to compare directly. Let's give these names and apply them with a missing fallback value. And well, look at that. Using an error guard or checking whether the variable exists first does make a difference. So there you've got it, state of the art. This is how you get the value of a variable, right? Another thing I at least want to do quite often, and I know there are others that want this as well, is I've got a namespace. I want to get all the variable names and all the variable values in a big table so that I can see what I'm dealing with. And this is the best I came up with after scratching my head for a while, for getting two lists, one of the names, one of the values, and yeah, don't even try to read it, whatever. If you want name value pairs, a slight modification on that. And then you spot, oh, look at that, we've got executes. Luckily, we know what to replace execute with. We just put that in there. Here we go. This is how you get name value pairs. Okay. Let's assume we could make a system function called like nameset, and it would take name value pairs, so that you could set them, and it takes an argument that's where you want to put them. If you don't specify the value that you want to set, just the names, then we could pick them up from the current namespace, so you can just move things over. Makes sense. If you want to pick values from somewhere else, you could, if you have a reference to that, you could dot into that and get it from there. Or of course, you could use a whole path with dots in them in the names. If you just want to set a single one, you have to remember to enclose it, because otherwise we can't see the difference between these two. If you have a namespace that's already populated with all the things you want, then we can give a reference to that. And if you don't specify where you want to do it, we'll just make a new namespace for you that contains that. So you can have all the parameters, all the names and values, and we'll just create a namespace for you to do that. And maybe you don't want names and values, so we could distinguish that by having a name list that's just a matrix of names. This is how you would get a list of names if you did things like quad_nl with a positive number. And similarly, for getting the value, imagine if you could just give name value pairs where the value is the fallback value. And if you don't specify fallback values, then you would get a value error. Of course, if you just want a single name with a fallback value, you'd have to enclose. Something that's also really useful is being able to do like a protected copy, like we do with workspaces occasionally, where I say, well, I already have all these settings here, but over here are my default settings, and anything that's missing from here, I want to get it from over there. to supply all the missing values. And of course, if you don't say where we get it from, then we get it from the current namespace where we are. And of course, you could dot in somewhere else and get it from there. And if you want to supply a separate list of names, list of values, then we can do that with a matrix as well, so we can distinguish them. And finally, let's say we want that whole listing of name and values together. We could do name values. And here there's not so much to take of arguments, but we could specify the name class of things so that we can say exactly what kind of variables we want. And we can then, just like with quadnl, distinguish as positive and negative values. We could use positive and negative values to decide whether we want a whole list of names as a matrix or we want separate values, name and value pairs. And of course, if you don't say where it comes from, we get it from right here. So you can always look at everything that's in the current namespace simply by running this, just like a quadnl, but a quadnv, for example, if you were to name it that. This is not definite, of course. And then I've just said where it comes from and where it goes to, and I've spoken of it as a single namespace, but it would be nice if you could populate many namespaces in one go without having to use an each, because as you might have met, if you try to use an each on a list of namespaces and one day there are no namespaces, it goes very bad. So if you just handle that, that would be nice. And of course, flexibility, use a reference, use a name of a namespace, it should all just work. You can, of course, mix and match as well. And it just means everything we've specified that we're going to get or set, it goes to every namespace on the left. And where we're going to get from or set to, that specifies also the kind of result we get if we fetch the values. So if we have a matrix of namespaces that we want to get values from, we get a matrix of those names values. How would it look if we actually try to do any of these jobs that we were talking about? Basic one, just want to get the value. And if we have a matrix of names, that's also fine, it'll just work. If you want to set names and values, and if you have a matrix of names and a list of values, that's fine as well. Let's say this problem. Currently, you have to do a whole control structure, if thing or conditional execute to set a default left value. And without any special syntax for it, we could just do it like this. Get the value of the left argument. If it's missing, use a fallback value, and then assign that to the left argument. Sometimes we want to join two namespaces. We have some parameters the user supplied. We have our default values, and we just join them together. And if you've got a whole bunch of settings, so we say we have a hierarchy of settings, and we want the most local or precise recent values to be the valid ones, and then fall back to other settings, then we could just apply that to a list. A lot of people have met this one. You get some data from somewhere, but something isn't there in the data, and then it's hard to do a general query. But here we can just supply a fallback value, and we'd use that. If we have got many namespaces, as I said, we can get all the values from all the namespaces, even from the namespaces that don't have this value. We'll just use the fallback value for those. And you can get many values from many namespaces. It all just works. Sometimes we want to build the namespace, and we've already got the names and the values. We can do that. We could also supply as name value pairs. So there's flexibility. Let's say we have a class, and we know already how we want to set all the fields that are in the class. Works exactly the same. Class instance. Let's say we have a table that we're reading in from a file, say called CSV, and we want to make a namespace from that. So we want the headers supply the variable becomes the variables. So we have to rotate things around to conform with the syntax, but it's not a whole lot of work. In fact, Quad CSV can already do this transposure for us. It's inverted tables, it's called. It still gives names of the columns as a vector vectors, But potentially we could extend that so that it could give you a matrix right away, and then it would just be ready for this new functionality. And if your column names are not valid APL names, then we could use this JSON mangle name thing that encodes any character vector to a valid APL name. And of course, this could be built-in functionality as well if we decided on that. The other direction, let's say we have a namespace and we want to generate a table from that. So let's get all the names and their values, and then we just throw them at Quad CSV. Again, Quad CSV doesn't allow currently a matrix of column names, but could probably be extended. And then if we have pairs instead, then we could do the transposure. And then we can display it as a proper table in APL format. It's not very useful for processing the data, but it could look nice, so we can do the mangling of the names if necessary. Here's an example where we're reading in some JSON data and getting names and values. Then we can, this is going to be a no-op, but in preparation for the next step, that we're going to join together the rows here, columns, are they going to be eventually, and then we just need to transpose them, and we get a nice looking table. I often use like a global parameter to control my debugging, testing things. So something I would do, you could use this inside a trap statement. You could just supply the parameter and have a default for that. And that's really it. I think it's all pretty obvious. I'd like to know what you have to say. There's plenty of time for this. This is, again, just a proposal. It's just an idea. If you have any questions, I would be happy to hear them. While I'm waiting for any questions coming up, I'll answer one question that might come up. Wait a minute. You took Quad NS, that already means something. I bet you didn't notice that this is a consistent extension of what Quad NS already does.
Thank you very much.